Good evening. My name is Richard Mallory, and I'd like to share what I experienced one night that changed the way I see any empty road. I'm telling you this because many people ignore signs that are too small to seem like a threat. I learned the hard way that it's precisely these details that can save someone's life. As I passed a reflective sign, I saw something in the mirror that made my throat clench. A clear smile appeared behind my trailer, a curved, defined smile that left no room for doubt. When I turned to check, there was nothing but the darkness of US 93 and the distant reflections of the early morning. Even so, that image remained stuck in my mind like a silent message I hadn't asked to receive. I kept driving, trying to believe it was just a distortion of the headlights, but there was too much clarity in that smile. It didn't look like a blur of light. It looked like a real mouth. Its precision bothered me, as if someone were positioned with millimeter precision at the exact point where the license plate could capture part of the face and return just enough for me to become suspicious. This idea made me more alert than I wanted, with the irritating feeling of being watched without knowing from where. In the next stretch, the right taillight flickered for less than a second. It wasn't asphalt vibration. It wasn't a road irregularity. It was an isolated touch, firm enough to move the internal rod. I know every noise my truck makes, and that oscillation indicated human contact, not mechanical contact. My hand gripped the steering wheel until my fingers cooled, while outwardly I pretended nothing had happened. Further on, as I passed under an isolated lamppost, I noticed a shadow falling too quickly into the lower corner of the trailer. It wasn't a tree shadow. It wasn't a sign reflection. It wasn't a flash of headlights. It was the kind of defensive movement someone makes in the dark to avoid being seen. The confirmation hit me like a weight on my chest, the kind that leaves no room for rational excuses. I knew there was something back there. The road was too empty. Not a single headlight in the rearview mirror, no glare from the opposite direction, no trucks sharing the road with me. Just the continuous sound of the engine, the whistling of the wind cutting through the metal, and the growing feeling that I wasn't alone. Isolation is dangerous when someone decides to travel clinging to your trailer without permission, especially when you have no idea what that person really wants. A few kilometers later, I felt a subtle shift in the frame. It wasn't the weight of the load, which was securely fastened and well distributed. It was human weight, moving slowly, as if adjusting the body to avoid losing traction. The metal vibrated in a way that was too organic to be caused by the wind or any residue from the track. My whole body responded to the signal before my mind could process it, as if the most instinctive part of me already knew there was something alive there. I tried to keep up the pace. No slowing down, no signaling that I had noticed. If the person was so close to the external structure, any sudden reaction could alter their plan. Micro clues appeared one after another. A noise here, a vibration there, a minimal change in the trailer's sway. Each new detail added to the previous one, creating a pattern that I didn't want to admit I understood. On the next uneven stretch, the trailer swayed asymmetrically. The left rear dipped for a moment as if someone had shifted their body weight to that side. It's a type of movement that no box, no pallet, and no animal trapped inside produces in that way. Whoever was there knew where to put their foot, where to hold on with their hand, how to use the truck as an extension of their own body. From that point on, I stopped seeing the road as a path and started seeing everything as a testing ground. Every curve, every patch of asphalt, every unevenness seemed like an opportunity for that person to get a few centimeters closer to the cab. The truck responded to every adjustment of the intruder, as if it were breathing along with the vehicle. It was like driving with someone glued to you, but outside your field of vision. As I entered a slightly brighter area, the side of the trailer caught a quick reflection. I saw part of a face again, but this time it wasn't just a smile. The light caught the curve of the jaw, a bit of the cheek, the skin pressed against the metal. It was a fraction of a second, but enough to confirm that the first reflection hadn't been an accident. I really did have someone hanging there, close enough to touch the back with my hand. Soon after, I heard a slow scraping sound on the metal sheet. It wasn't wind blowing, it wasn't a branch scraping, it wasn't a stone kicked up by the tires. It was the clear sound of fingers running across the aluminum in a steady, almost lazy rhythm. It wasn't a cry for help, it wasn't a sign of desperation. It was the kind of warning that doesn't need a voice, just intention. The message was simple. I'm here, and you know it. By this point, my breathing was no longer keeping pace with the engine. Nothing about it seemed improvised. This was someone who understood truck blind spots, someone accustomed to using metal structures as temporary shelter. This kind of skill doesn't belong to someone who's just running from something. It belongs to someone who waits, observes, and chooses. The truck becomes a tool, not a hiding place. I even considered stopping at the next gas station, but I discarded the idea immediately. An intruder with that kind of behavior wouldn't get out in a well-lit area. He would wait for the moment when I was most vulnerable, refueling, filling out paperwork, checking the cargo, distracted by some routine. So I did the opposite of what any frightened driver would do. I stayed on course and turned onto a secondary road narrower with long curves and poor side visibility. The person reacted badly to the change of route. On the first tighter curve, I felt an urgent movement in the lower part of the rear. The metal responded with a dry crack, as if someone had forced support where they shouldn't have. The truck reacted, pulling slightly to one side for a moment. Whoever was behind tried to reposition themselves quickly, and that made it clear that it wasn't the first time that person had done this. Shortly after, the vibration changed again. It was no longer just someone clinging to the trailer. It was someone trying to climb up. First onto the lower bar, then seeking support somewhere between the axle and the frame. The pattern of the touches betrayed an attempt to gain height, to get closer to the fifth wheel. The intruder seemed to be testing how far they could advance without losing traction, as if searching for the exact spot to wait for the perfect moment to approach. I maintained a steady speed, even with my heart racing, because I knew that every sudden change could be exploited by him. The night seemed to swallow everything around me. No headlights behind, no city lights on the horizon, no sign of life beyond my own vehicle. Only my presence clinging to the truck, advancing inch by inch. The feeling was of being studied by someone who had all the time in the world. In some sections I felt small, sharp shocks in the structure, right in the area between the longitudinal beam and the base of the trailer, as if the intruder were touching it with their foot, backing away, touching it again, searching for stability. It wasn't imbalance, it was a method. Whoever does this isn't trying to survive the trip. They're practicing approach, testing how many adjustments they can make before the driver gets too suspicious. Then, as I passed near an abandoned maintenance shed, a faint side light fell back on the metal, and the smile reappeared. This time, not as a blur. It was half the dental arch clearly reflected along with the shadow of the chin, bright enough to freeze my spine. It was the same smile that had appeared on the plaque, but now closer, more defined, almost satisfied to know that I had seen it. That made me certain that I wasn't dealing with someone who just wanted a ride on the street. There was something deeper in that behavior. It wasn't what he did, but how he did it. Whoever smiles while trapped in that position isn't running from anything. They're enjoying being there, hidden and so close to a driver who doesn't even know where the threat is coming from. From that point on, any reduction in speed became a negotiation between fear and necessity. If I slowed down too much, I brought the intruder closer to the cabin and made it easier for them to access the ladder. If I maintained a high speed, I prolonged the journey with someone glued to the rear, gaining time for them to test every inch of the structure. Every decision with my foot on the pedal seemed to give or take away an advantage from that person, as if it were a game where only they knew the rules. I decided to slow down gradually, but so smoothly that it seemed like just adapting to the terrain. No sudden braking, no visible movement. Even so, the trailer responded with a heavier vibration, more concentrated on the left side. That betrayed that the intruder had noticed the slowdown. He changed position again, pressing the metal harder, as if preparing for a larger, decisive move. Next, I noticed a series of short taps, almost like very short steps sliding across the frame. He was moving, searching for another point of support, perhaps trying to reach the area just behind the cab. Each tap sounded like a test, as if he were gauging how much my truck could handle before I noticed an abrupt change in the vehicle's behavior. It was precisely at that moment that, out of nowhere, an old car appeared slowly on the right. Weak headlights, engine sputtering as if it were struggling to stay running uphill. It pulled right in front of me, cutting my line and forcing me to slow down more than I intended. It wasn't a choice. It was a reflex. I had to slam on the brakes to avoid rear-ending it. The sudden reduction in speed caused the trailer to sway violently, not in the typical response of a load, but with an uneven jolt, as if something loose back there had missed its breaking point. The whole assembly reacted as if part of the weight had shifted outwards, and I felt the axle groan for a second. Immediately afterwards came the sound that ended any doubt. The impact that followed wasn't from equipment or a piece of tire coming loose. It was a dry thud against the asphalt. Heavy, unique, the kind only a body produces when it loses support at high speed. After that, the vibration of the structure changed. The sensation of external weight disappeared as if someone had taken a wet coat off my back. All that remained was the truck, the cargo, and the silence. The old car drove on, oblivious to everything that had just happened behind me. I stayed on course. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't brake again. I didn't slow down to check. The worst thing you can do in a situation like that is hesitate. Going back to that point on the road wouldn't yield any answers worth the risk of encountering whoever it was, alive or not, conscious or not. I kept going until I reached the truck company's illuminated yard almost 40 minutes later. When I finally parked, the adrenaline was still coursing through my skin, as if my body hadn't yet understood that I had arrived. I got out slowly, felt the hard ground beneath my boots, and walked to the back of the truck. With the sensation that each step cost more than the kilometers I had driven. The mark was there, a recent handprint, with the displaced dust forming an irregular trail, and a lighter trace where fingers had slid trying to regain their grip. There were no other marks around, no sign that the person had used the trailer as a simple platform to get on and off. It was the trail of someone who stayed there until the very last second. I stood there observing that mark for far too long, listening to the silence of the yard mixed with the distant noise of other trucks that had nothing to do with my night. Nothing about it was a coincidence. Nothing was an exaggeration of my imagination. It wasn't luck nor skill nor experience that prevented that person from reaching my cabin. The only reason I'm still here to tell this story is simple. I was going too fast to become a target. And since that night, every time I see a strange reflection in the car's bodywork, I remember that somewhere along the road there might always be someone hiding, waiting for the wrong driver to slow down at the wrong time. If you're enjoying these chilling stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any more terrifying tales to come. Now, get ready for another journey down dark and mysterious roads. My name is Carson, and I've been through some tough times on the road, but nothing compares to what happened that night. I'm not telling this to impress anyone. I'm telling it because if I hadn't paid attention to a detail that seemed insignificant, I probably wouldn't be here to talk about it. The danger didn't appear in a grand way. It approached slowly, hidden, as if it were waiting for the exact moment when I let my guard down. I should never have stopped at that unfinished access road. But the choice was simple. Stop there, or lose control. I just didn't expect to see a shadow creeping up my mirror, as if it were already surrounding me. I had driven that highway a few times before, but almost never at that hour. It was late, the kind of early morning when the radio loses signal and even the truck drivers disappear from the channel. That specific stretch always bothered me, because it seemed like someone had started building something there and simply given up halfway through. Days before, I had noticed in passing that access road next to the main lane, a strange rectangle of asphalt that led to no city, no farm, no industry. Just a piece of amputated road in the middle of nowhere. That night, however, I wasn't analyzing any project. I was battling fatigue and a persistent feeling while driving. With each kilometer, the steering wheel seemed to lean a little more to the right, as if the truck wanted to slide slightly out of its lane. I corrected it. It obeyed, and a few minutes later the movement returned. It wasn't strong enough to be an obvious defect, but it was too annoying to ignore. That's how it starts, with something too small to justify stopping, but big enough to stay in your head. When I spotted the access road, my first impulse was to drive straight past. The stretch of asphalt plunged a few meters into the darkness and ended abruptly in an area of compacted dirt with some old tire tracks and shallow, shadowy potholes. There was no sign, no gas station, no light. Just a strange cut in the side of the highway, like an open door to a place no one had finished building. I slowed down and for a few seconds considered risking continuing to the next gas station. The steering wheel jerked again. Harder. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. I turned the truck into the driveway, and as soon as the wheels left the main lane, the feeling changed. The highway behind me seemed to have been switched off. The sound of the tires on the asphalt was swallowed by a dense, absurd silence, as if I had crossed an invisible barrier. I turned off the engine and for a few moments remained seated there, my hands still on the steering wheel, waiting to hear what one always hears in any open place. Wind, insects, some distant noise of traffic, the normal crackle of metal cooling. Nothing came. Only my own breathing, too loud inside the cabin, the kind of silence that makes you pay attention to things you normally ignore. I opened the door slowly, more out of habit than courage, and got out with my flashlight in hand. The ground was so compacted that my footsteps were almost silent. The yellowish light of the flashlight swept across the dead entrance, revealing details that the headlights had hidden, remnants of cones thrown in a corner, pieces of old wood, tire tracks so old they were almost faded. It looked more like an abandoned yard than a rest area. It was a place that a sensible driver would avoid. I was only there because I had no other choice. That's when I heard the first noise. It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening, it was just different. A slight movement of something behind the cab, as if a small object had been pushed from side to side. I turned the flashlight in the immediate direction of the sound, expecting to see some piece of scrap metal rolling or a plastic bag being dragged. I saw nothing. Just the side of the truck and the darkness behind it. Solid, motionless. It must have been my imagination, I thought. But the problem with being in a place like that is that your mind starts cooperating with the environment. I forced myself to focus on the original reason for the stop. I approached the front of the truck, illuminating the wheel and suspension. I touched the tire, checked the sidewall, looked at the ground. No cuts, no oil, no apparent play. No clear reason for the steering to be behaving that way. Still, I felt in my body the memory of how the steering wheel had pulled to one side just before I got in there. It wasn't my imagination. Something had changed. That's when the second noise came. This time, it was more defined. A sharp crack in the back of the trailer, followed by a minimal vibration, as if something had touched the bodywork and recoiled. It wasn't a rock impact. It wasn't the sound of a branch. It was the kind of sound you immediately associate with a controlled touch. Someone touching an object to see how it reacts. I froze for a few seconds with the flashlight pointed at the ground. Then I slowly raised the beam of light towards the rear. The cone illuminated the outline of the truck and part of the bushes behind it. It was at that moment that a shadow emerged from the wrong place. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was more like a quick distortion at the edge of my field of vision, a blur that shifted position without any physical justification. The feeling was that someone had moved from one point to another outside the flashlight's range, using the darkness as cover. My first reaction was to rationalize. It could be a reflection, an illusion, my tired brain filling in the gaps. Then the metal shook again, now on the opposite side. That was no illusion. I instinctively stepped back, taking one step, then another, until I was within reach of the door. I didn't run. I knew that running would draw attention, and part of me didn't want whatever was outside to realize that whatever was inside had noticed. I climbed into the cabin with as much self-control as I could muster, closed the door with almost theatrical slowness, and locked the doors, avoiding making unnecessary noise. The silence grew. I could hear my own heart pounding inside my head. The window glass reflected part of the cabin's interior, and for some reason that bothered me much more than if it were completely dark. I didn't want to see anything emerging behind me in the reflection. Then the passenger side door handle moved. It wasn't a slam. It wasn't someone pulling forcefully. It was a short, measured, almost polite movement, as if someone were testing the doorknob's limit. The handle went down a little and returned to its place. A second later, the gesture was repeated, slowly, without haste, without urgency. That's when I understood it wasn't just about presence. It was about interest. I held my breath, waiting for the next movement. Instead, what came was a very faint, almost imperceptible sound from under the right window, the dragging of something hard against the metal sheet, rising towards the mirror. I followed with my eyes the path it would take if it were a hand. And it was exactly at that imaginary point that the rearview mirror began to move. He tilted it a few millimeters, as if someone were pushing from underneath with a finger, trying to adjust the angle. Very slowly, to a point where I would never have left that mirror at a normal travel adjustment. I stood there staring, unable to react, while my mind tried to follow any logic that would make sense of it. Vandal? No. Thief? No. Who approaches a truck parked in a dead-end, unlit driveway, fiddling with the mirror and door handle with such calm? I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been 10 seconds. It could have been a whole minute. What broke the trance was a new stimulus. A continuous vibration ran along the side of the truck as if something were walking very close to the metal, lightly touching it as it passed. The sensation wasn't of footsteps. It was as if a weight were sliding around, assessing each part before moving on to the next. Someone, or something, was circling my truck. It was only at that moment that I truly felt surrounded. Until then, I could believe it was a localized manifestation, an isolated movement at a specific point. But when I realized the vibration was moving, circling the vehicle, I understood there was an intention there. It wasn't by chance. It was a kind of inspection. My instinct gave me a single command: get out of there. Now. My hand trembled as I turned the key. For an interminable second, the engine just turned over without starting. The dashboard lit up, went out, came back on, as if deciding whether or not to help me. The vibration from outside continued, now at the rear. I imagined, without wanting to imagine, someone standing behind the truck looking directly at the doors, as if they knew exactly what was inside, as if they were checking if it was worth forcing their way in. The engine finally started. The sound of the diesel exploding broke the silence so violently that I was almost more frightened by it than by everything that had happened before. I didn't wait for it to warm up. I didn't wait for anything. I engaged the gear and started to move the truck, even without being able to clearly see the end of the access road. That's when something stopped it. I don't know any other way to describe it. The cab jolted, as if the trailer had snagged on some invisible obstacle. There was no pothole ahead, no concrete blocks, nothing to justify that sudden blockage. The truck moved forward 1/2 meter and stopped. The engine roared, the torque demanded movement, but something seemed to resist from the outside, as if an opposing force wanted, just for a moment, to keep me there. That instant was enough for me to see in the mirror on the left. In the background, at the edge of the yellowish light of the fallen lantern on the ground, there was a shadow, an elongated, thin silhouette, standing beside the cart. Too tall to be a teenager, too short to be an average adult. The outline was strange, as if the body lacked uniform proportions. The head seemed slightly tilted, as if observing something with exaggerated attention. I floored it with all my might. The truck lurched, as if it had come loose from something stuck in the back, and began to move. The rear wheels spun on the hard-packed dirt. The cab shook more than it should have. But in seconds I was back on the road, instinctively straightening the vehicle and feeling the wind return, as if someone had turned the sound system back on outside. Reflexively, I glanced in the mirror. The unfinished access road was shrinking rapidly behind me, swallowed by the darkness. In the last stretch still reached by the light of the fallen flashlight, I swear I saw a dark shape standing on the edge, motionless, as if it had remained there only to watch my departure. I didn't wait to be sure. I accelerated until I found a lit gas station a few kilometers ahead. When I stopped under a spotlight and got out, still with adrenaline pumping, I walked around the truck. I wanted some kind of explanation. What I found were 4 long parallel marks drawn in the dirt on the right side, exactly where I had felt the vibration swirling around the vehicle. They looked like fingers running from end to end. The height was wrong for someone standing, wrong for someone crouching. I ran my hand over one of them. The dirt came off on my fingers with the same smell of dry earth from that dead access road. That night, I didn't sleep in the cabin. I stayed inside the gas station, staring at the television until the sky cleared. Nobody there paid any attention to the marks. To the others, it was just road debris. To me, it was a reminder that that place wasn't empty. And, since then, every time I see an unfinished access road on the side of any highway, I don't argue with myself. I just drive straight past it. My name is Michael Turner. I'm 41 years old and I've been driving for the same trucking company long enough to know that a coincidence doesn't repeat itself 3 times in a row. The first time, you ignore it. The second time, you pay attention. The third time, you realize you've become a target. And that's exactly what happened that week when someone started appearing on the toll cameras a few minutes before me, walking, wearing the same dark cap, and turning their face towards the booth as if they were waiting for me to arrive. I was transporting a load of industrial equipment from Amarillo to Georgia, a long route, clean on paper, but one that often attracts criminal gangs because it involves crossing 3 states with extensive and poorly lit stretches. The company doesn't like to admit it, but in recent months some drivers had been blocked by unmarked pickup trucks, and several cargo containers were found empty days later. None of this made it to the media. The transport company covered it all up. And as always, those who drive end up paying the price. The first strange toll booth appeared in North Texas. I stopped because the transponder malfunctioned, and the attendant told me to wait. Behind him, on the internal monitors, the image showed the shoulder lane. A thin man walked slowly past, hands in his pockets, cap pulled down. 3 seconds later, he raised his face directly to the camera. The clock showed a little over 8 minutes before I arrived. It wasn't illegal for someone to walk there, but nobody walks in a technical area without looking for something, or someone. I let it pass. Anything becomes a threat when we're tired. The problem is that an hour later, in Oklahoma, it happened again. Same transponder malfunction, same procedure of entering to get a receipt. There were the internal images, and the same man passed through the frame, repeating the same movement. Cap, head down, then raises his face. The time, 7 minutes before I parked. The perfect repetition was the kind of thing that sets off red flags for any professional. An inevitable mental micro-hook. Someone knew where I was and was keeping a calculated distance. At the third toll booth already in Arkansas, the feeling turned into certainty. The camera showed the same guy crossing the restricted area, now faster, almost diagonally, as if he were in a hurry to gain ground. He looked at the booth with the same absurd precision. The attendant commented, without realizing the impact, that a man had asked minutes before if the red truck from Texas had already passed. It was impossible to ignore after that. Someone was on my route, keeping a precise interval, as if tracking my progress through the toll booths themselves. I sped off more than I should have and deliberately changed my driving style. It was my first real test. No brakes, no obvious routes. I drove straight past 2 rest areas I would normally use. If someone was actually following me based on the toll booth logic, I would completely break the sequence. 3 hours later, I took a little used side road and entered a state highway full of curves, potholes, and stretches where radios lose signal. No gang likes to work there. Bad territory for an ambush. But when I arrived at a small state way station, I was forced to stop. The inspector took my documents, checked the license plate, and wait. In the background, there was a chair slowly spinning, as if someone had gotten up seconds before. The monitor showed an external recording. There, once again, the same man had passed by, minutes before, asking the inspector about a loaded red truck. It was mine. I didn't need anything more to understand that this wasn't traffic. It was a hunt. I returned to the truck with a burning micro-hook in my stomach. Someone wasn't just in front of me. They were trying to predict my decisions. This required 3 things: access to my route, communication with support vehicles, and sufficient observation time. No ordinary pedestrian has that. No curious onlooker follows trucks with that level of precision. I decided to seek help before things escalated. I called the company and reported transponder malfunctions. The response was indifferent. I mentioned strange behavior at the toll booths. They told me not to worry about paranoia in the middle of the night. It was the kind of response that leaves a truck driver to fend for himself. I then checked my fuel card. I called the call center and asked for a check of recent attempts. The operator informed me that there was a declined refueling attempt at a gas station almost 200 miles ahead of me. That was impossible. I'd never been there. There was only one explanation. My card had been cloned. And that only happens when someone physically gets close to a document or some vulnerable piece of company equipment. I had further confirmation that I was a planned target, not just a coincidence. At the next truck stop, while trying to think clearly on the illuminated parking lot floor, I noticed a dark pickup truck parked in the distance without turn signals, its low beams almost off. A micro-survival tip. Vehicles parked too dark never bode well in the early morning hours. I went back to the cab and checked the dash cam. In a previous stretch, the same pickup truck had appeared briefly, pulling alongside for a few seconds before backing away. It was a reconnaissance pattern, typical of gangs that choose their target and wait for an opportunity. I then called the State Highway Patrol and reported everything objectively. Repeated pedestrian sighting, attempts to refuel with a cloned card, suspicious pickup truck, altered route. To my surprise, the response wasn't skeptical. The officer asked me to follow the road to a specific toll booth, where they would set up a discreet observation point. He told me to maintain a constant speed and not stop under any circumstances until I got there. I continued driving and the road became increasingly empty. At a certain point, the dark pickup truck reappeared in my rearview mirror, advancing slowly, maintaining a calculated distance. A clear microhook, someone studying behavior before acting. It pulled alongside, spent a few seconds analyzing the cabin, then tried to force me onto the shoulder on a single-lane curve. I responded with a long honk, flashing my lights, and a sharp change of position within the lane, enough to show that I wasn't going to give way. The vehicle backed up a few meters, but maintained its presence, like an animal testing its prey's reaction. When I finally entered the toll booth route indicated by the police, I noticed 2 patrol cars discreetly positioned in blind spots between trucks parked in the service area ahead. As soon as I stopped within the designated lane, an officer approached, asked for my documents, and requested that I remain inside the booth while they reviewed footage from the last few hours. Half an hour later, they returned with something that cleared up the final doubt. The same man in a dark cap appeared on the toll booth cameras, gas station cameras, and even the camera from the previous truck stop, always on foot, always making movements as if he were clearing a path for the pickup truck behind me. In 2 videos, he was talking to drivers of that pickup truck, handing them slips of paper with handwritten numbers. One of those numbers was identical to the one scribbled on my cargo slip. It was the missing link. The police cars set off in pursuit of the pickup truck. They found the vehicle parked at a smaller gas station, with 2 men inside and a bag containing cloned cards, cut security seals, a clipboard with toll schedules, and a list of target trucks. The only thing they didn't find was the man in the cap, who disappeared without a trace. Gangs of this type always have someone quick, who knows how to disappear into the chaos before the police arrive. After giving my statement, I was released to continue my journey. The company barely commented on what happened, focusing only on the integrity of the cargo and the blocked card. The road goes on. Life goes on. But one certainty has stuck with me since that night. No one shows up at 3 consecutive toll booths looking at the same booth by chance. Someone was waiting for an opportunity. And if I hadn't changed my route, accelerated the brake from the pattern, and called for help, perhaps I would have been just another empty truck found days later. I never found out who the man in the cap was, and honestly, I prefer it that way. Some people only exist to test how attentive you are. The road taught me one last thing on that trip. Anyone who manages to stay a few minutes ahead of you isn't just following the same route. They're choosing the exact moment you're going to stop. And when that moment arrives, there's rarely a second chance to tell what happened.